Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest edition of the SLAM seminar series. So it's a pleasure to have with us today Dr. Menachem Stern, who goes by Naki. He's currently a postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania in the Department of Physics and Astronomy, where he's working with Andrea Liu and Vijay Balasubramaniam. Before this, he was a grad student at the University of Chicago, where we overlapped. So he's going to talk about learning in physical networks and analogies between physical networks and biological and computational systems. So this is something he started working with Arvind Murugan and Sid Nagel at University of Chicago. So I'm sure we are all excited to hear from Naki. So please go ahead, Naki, over to you.
Thank you, Kinjal, for the very kind introduction. So as you said, today I'm going to talk about some of our work on physical interpretation of learning, what I'd like to call learning machines. And without further ado, I'll start here. So I'm going to talk about learning, which is kind of it's a bit of an interesting term. So I'd like to define it before we start talking about it. So at least my definition for learning for the purpose of this talk is that a learning system is a system that's given some external signals, which are inputs, and then on its own, it develops some functional responses to these inputs. We're going to look at how that can happen. And these days, usually when we think about learning, I just want to say that if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask during the talk. So usually when we think about learning these days, we think about machine learning. Well, for example, we want to distinguish between pictures of cats and dogs, and we do this with more or less fancy programs that we call machine learning algorithms, like neural networks that I'm drawing here. But it turns out that the way that these systems learn, if you compare them to real physical or biological systems that learn, they do it very differently. And if you wanted to implement the same kinds of algorithms that computers use, then you're going to have a really tough time doing it in real physical systems. And we're going to talk about why that is. So I'd like to, here in this first slide, to sort of summarize the differences that I'm seeing, the big differences between computational learning and physical learning. The first of which is that computational learning usually starts from defining a cost function, what you want the system to do, and then you minimize it. But in a physical system, there's no really fundamental cost function to speak of, and the functionality sort of emerges from the interaction between different parts. And if you think about how these systems are learning, then computational learning machines or machine learning algorithms usually do something like gradient descent, which you can think about as going in and changing each one of the parameters of the network manually. While if an analogous physical system would have to use something else, like a local learning we'll discuss at length. And because of that, computational learning systems really need some sort of a central agency, some CPU or a GPU that can compute the cost function and do the modifications. While in a physical system, everything is distributed between every part of the system, and learning emerges as a function of the entire system. So of course, in this talk, I would like to look at the right column of this table and ask how we can do this in a physical system. So in general, I'm inspired by both learning theory and biology, and we try to study how to realize these kinds of physical learning needs. And we think about this both in theory, modeling, simple systems, but also we try to do it in laboratory experiments. So let me motivate a little bit why we like to think about physical learning. So first I want to posit that physical learning machines sit sort of in between computational learning algorithms and biological learning systems like the brain. And we can use the things that we know from both these sides of the spectrum to get ideas about what physical learning is. So from machine learning, for example, we can think about minimizing a cost function or doing supervised or unsupervised learning. But from the biological side, we can also take inspiration from neuroscience and biology to think about local learning rules, about the importance of the structure and hierarchies of the network, and also the physical constraints that limit what a physical system can and cannot learn. So we can use these ideas to inform our study of physical learning machines, and also maybe use these ideas to get some more intuition about computational biological systems. But there are also interesting applications that one might think of with these physical learning machines, like building smart metamaterials that have particular desired properties that can get them on their own, but also neuromorphic computing, which is a big field these days, trying to build machine learning algorithms in physical systems, and also robotics. So I already said the word physical learning a lot of times in this short talk so far. So let's take some inspiration what that might look like. So we know that there are many biological systems that learn in order to facilitate life, and they're all learning according to the definition that I laid out at the start. Here are a few of them. And I'd like to take one of them to take some inspiration to think about physical learning. And no, I'm not going to talk about natural neural networks these days. Actually, I'm going to talk about biomechanical nets, which fit a lot more our intuition about soft matter, living matter, these kinds of things. So biomechanical nets are everywhere in our bodies, and they do all kinds of very important functions, like they support the structure of the cell, they aid in replication and communication. And if you think about them, these networks are really multifunctional, dynamical, and they constantly change based on the environmental signals that they're getting. So these are, according to my definition, learning systems. So let's try to think about them. But of course, I'm a theoretical physicist, so thinking about this system right here, it's still too complicated to me, so I want to abstract it as much as I can. I'm going to think about a spring network, an elastic network of balls and springs. And you see that I color-coded it in a certain way, so let me define what these parameters are. I have here pink degrees of freedom x, which I call the physical degrees of freedom. For example, these are the node positions in the network. And there are also, in orange, learning degrees of freedom, w, which you can think of as the stiffness of a spring. And they have different roles. So the physical degrees of freedom tends to minimize some sort of a scalar function. In this case, it's the elastic energy of the network. And we don't really have to worry about that. This happens automatically by the physics, by the second law of thermodynamics. But there's another set of degrees of freedom, the learning degrees of freedom, that we can modify so that the system gains function. And this modification of the learning degrees of freedom W will happen by a physical learning rule that we'll discuss in a bit, or at least we'll discuss some of them in a bit. But what is a physical learning rule? And you can ask, well, what can a physical system learn to begin with? There are certain things that physical systems cannot do, they cannot see or hear, and they definitely don't know what they're being trained for. Definitely not in advance. But it stands to reason that they can measure, in some sense, the physical state X that they're in. So you can think of a physical learning rule as some sort of a dynamical system that changes the learning parameters W as a function of the current physical state X. So you can think about it as a cycle. You have a physical state that you get by energy minimization, for example, and then you use this physical state to inform a physical learning rule, changing the parameters a little bit. And this cycle goes on and on until the system gains a desired function. So one very famous example for this kind of physical learning rule comes from neuroscience. This is Hebb's rule for neurons that fire together, wire together. And you can imagine that this is really a local rule because the system, every synapse only needs to know what the neurons around it are doing. They don't care about what happens far away in the network. And here's another example that's a bit closer to home. This is called directed aging, and this is the local learning rule for elastic systems that was experimented and developed in collaboration with Sid Nagel's lab in Chicago and Andrea Liu's lab in Philadelphia at Penn. And in this case, you put a system in a certain desired state, let's say this state right here, and you let it age in that state. And it turns out that if you do it correctly, then the next time that you apply the force, the same force, it will tend to go into the same state that you like. So this is also a local learning rule, because every bond in this network, in order to change its parameters, in this case the stiffness, everything that it needs to know is the stress that it is encountering at the time. So this is completely local information. So let me first go into an unsupervised learning problem, and we think about how we can train an elastic system to have multi-stability. Different states that are all going to be, all of these states are desired by some user, and we imagine them as minima of an energy landscape like this. So each one of these minima might correspond to one of the shapes of the network that we want it to be stabilized in. You can imagine that this kind of problem is very useful for both engineered systems and biological systems. This is a very cool example. You have here a red blood cell that can take different shapes according to the flow around it. So, for example, if it wants to flow through very narrow channels, it goes into the slipper shape and then it can fit more easily. So our goal here is to physically train a material, an elastic network, with multiple desired stable states. With a certain interesting twist, we want to do it in a continual way. So we want to be able to train new states as we go, keeping the old ones. So you can imagine that this is, for example, this is already something that we don't want to do on a computer, because we might not know in advance what are all the stable states that we like to have in the system. So how do we do that? So we take some inspiration from a local learning rule that was suggested in DNA origami in drawing polymers. And the idea is that you can seed polymers in certain places in space. And if you wait long enough, they tend to connect and create a bond between them. So here's the learning rule that I want to suggest. You take state one, which you want to stabilize, and you put all of the nodes where you want them to be. These are the physical degrees of freedom X. And then you connect every pair of neighbors up to some distance with an unstrained bond W. And you do this for all of your nodes, and you get a state which is stable by construction because all of the springs here are unstrained. So that's good. But now we have state number two. So we reshape the network into the new shape, which now looks like this. And we keep all of the springs that we had before, but now we add a new set of springs between all of the neighbors. And these springs are now going to be unstrained in state two. But you can see that once you have more than one state encoded in the system, they interfere, because the springs that are associated with state one are strained in state two, and vice versa. So did we do it? Can we stabilize these two states in the network? And it turns out that if you use usual garden variety Hookean springs, the answer is no. So what I'm drawing here is a cut of the energy landscape, and the stars correspond to the two states that I want to stabilize. And if you look at the energy landscape, you see that the minimum is someplace else. So in this case, none of these two states are actually stable. Okay, so we failed. But let's not despair just yet, because we might be able to use different springs. In this case, I'm thinking about nonlinear springs with some custom power parameter here. So 2 means Hookean spring, it's this parabola here. But if we reduce this parameter, then we get a new potential which becomes softer and softer farther from zero. So the wings become very flat. And it turns out that if we use power parameter less than 1, then we can in fact stabilize multiple states in sequence. Here's again the energy landscape. And now you can see that the two states corresponding to the two stars are minima of the landscape, which means that we have successfully stabilized these two states in the network at the same time. And if you look at cuts of the energy landscape for different values of this parameter psi, then you see that there is really a transition that happens at psi equal to 1. Above that, you see that the minima are not at these dashed lines where the minima, where the stable states are supposed to be. But as we go to psi below 1, you see that these are now the minima of the system, the minima of the energy.
Sorry, Naki, quick question. So, what were your rules for creating the state 2? I thought one I understood was just connecting nodes that were within a cutoff radius, correct?
Yeah. So state 2 is going to be exactly the same, but with a different configuration.
Okay, different configuration of nodes.
Yeah, and the caveat is that we keep all the springs that we had from state 1. So we have two states,
Understood.
two sets of springs, one for each state.
And in the energy landscape plots that you showed, what were the degrees of what was the parameter space? Like what are the two axes?
So this x-axis is it's actually a very high-dimensional energy landscape. The x-axis is the line that connects the two memories.
Okay.
The two states, and the y-axis is some orthogonal axis that I chose.
In the space of these spring constants, or
in the space of the x's.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
And Naki, can I ask a quick question here as well?
Yeah.
So with regard to the nonlinearity, when you this is only a nonlinearity that acts for large distances, is that correct? And so close to the minima, the spring is still Hookean. They're still.
Yes, at least the way that we think about it in the publication itself. Then close to 0, you have a Hookean spring.
Yes.
Range, but then it becomes softer on the wing.
And so you showed that varying the exponent to be less than 1, so sublinear, helps to localize these multi-stable minimas. What about the range? What about the range over which, where you switch from being Hookean to nonlinear?
So it turns out that that's a great question. So this length scale that gives you the crossover between Hookean to nonlinear determines the localization of the state. So if you take two states that are closer together than this length scale, then they tend to be considered the same state by the system.
Yeah.
And this is the limiting factor of
so it's your resolution, essentially.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. So now that we see that this works, we can also at least try to explain it. And the explanation that we want to give has to do with an analogy to sparse regression in statistics. So here's the energy function that is minimized by the network, and this is the energy given by the springs. So if you think about what this term looks like, or at least what the energy contours look like, they have a very different shape depending on what this psi parameter is. And if it's larger than 1, all of these contours tend to be very curved like this. And if you think about the points that minimize this energy, they happen, in some point on the curve, which if you look at the parameters here, they are both finite. But if you look at what happens when we look at nonlinear springs, for example, psi equal to 1, then these contours tend to be, they have corners. They are non-analytic. And it turns out that the places where the energy is minimized are going to be at the corners, or nearly always at the corners of these contours. And these corners have a nice property that they are sparse. You see that in this case, W1 is going to be finite, but W2 is 0. And in this case, W2 is finite and W1 is 0. So minimizing energy functions that look like this with nonlinear parameters tends to give you sparse solutions. And this is known in statistics. But we see it also in our system. If you look at systems that we stabilize with nonlinear springs, then they have corners in their energy contours, which always tend to which almost always tend to minimize the energy. And these have this property that you get sparse strain profiles. So if you look at the strain on the springs, in this case, you see that a lot of them are unstrained. And this corresponds to, these unstrained springs correspond to the memory that we are currently in. And all of the strained springs are far away. They correspond to different stable states that are currently not activated. And the interpretation that we give is that all of these faraway states that are very strained, you don't care about them so much because the energy, because of the nonlinear energy, the force associated with them is very small if they are far away. So I hope that made sense. But now that we can do this, let's see some applications that we can have with this sort of game. And these are all theoretical, but we can think about them still. So the first one is a shape-shifting material. Here's some inspiration that I took from a nice work with robotics. And these types of robots can walk around and make these shapes. So I was inspired by this, and I wanted to stabilize these three shapes in the network as three different states in a network with 35 nodes. So when I try to stabilize this with psi equal to 0.6, you can see that if I start with some initial condition, which is not exactly the star, but I let it relax, and it will relax into something that looks like the star state. And I hope I can convince you that all of these states are stabilized at the same time by doing this. So I can start from something that looks like a wrench, it will stabilize to the wrench state, but then I can push it a little bit above a hill, and it will go into the other two states. So you can stabilize all of them at the same time. So this is sort of a shape-shifting material, but we can also do something that's more like what we might think.
Sorry, could you say again, what were the interactions there?
So in this case, we have 35 nodes in this network. They are all connected by springs, and there is a set of springs corresponding to each one of those three states.
This is all in theory?
This is the simulation.
Okay, it looks very experimental intensity. Yeah.
This is an experiment, the top left, but this is a simulation.
Okay, thank you.
Another thing that we can do is to think about pattern recognition, which is more like a computational task. And this is the famous MNIST handwritten digits dataset. And let's try to do something with this. So what I try to do is to take a bunch of zeros here, take their average, and encode them as a state in a large spring network with 400 nodes in this case. And I call this state 0. And at the same time, I can encode a different state, which I call state 1. This is an average of a lot of these ones here. Now, depending on an initial condition that I give it, let's see what it gives me back. So this is some other zero from the data set, which I did not use this for the training. I did not use it for defining what state 0 is. But depending on the springs that I chose to stabilize these two states, I see if I chose the nonlinear springs, I get a state which is very much like this one, like what I call state 0, which tells me that the system believes that this initial condition belongs to the same kind of object that state 0 is. And I can do the same thing with state 1. And you can see that it only works if I use nonlinear springs. If I use linear springs, then I get some sort of chimeric state, and the system really doesn't know what this thing is.
So, Naki, another quick question over here. Just to make sure I'm following what you've actually implemented. So for each of these pixels, what are we seeing in the pixels, right? So the color, the white and the grayscale is represented by the physical nodes, or the value of the spring stiffnesses?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the spring stiffnesses are all the same. And the way of encoding this network is looking at every pixel, recording its intensity value, which is a scalar, and I'm encoding this as the position of a node in a one-dimensional spring network. So if I have 400 pixels here, then I'm going to have 400 nodes, the position of which is associated with the intensity of the pixel. And then I'm connecting them with unstrained springs according to the rule that I discussed before.
Yes, and then but then you do all-to-all connectivity.
In this case, it's all-to-all.
All-to-all, I see. Okay. Does it matter if you try to connect them in a different way, or if you use the fact that this is a 2D image, so you make a 2D network? If you change the quote-unquote physical network architecture, does it matter? Are there benefits?
So I don't know if there are benefits or not. We did try to actually encode this, as a sort of a zero with two-dimensional networks, and it seemed to work, but we haven't done this in a very systematic way. So this was sort of a demonstration that we can do this. I do not know how to answer your question in general. It definitely makes a difference, but I don't know what would be better and under which circumstances.
Okay. And how much potential fine-tuning is needed when you do the training?
In what do you mean by fine-tuning?
In terms of the sort of learning rate, in terms of how much I guess you're not you don't have a large training set, right? You just use the average, state 0 and state 1, and then you assign it once, and that's it, right?
Yeah, it's literally one shot.
Okay. So you don't have the issues that otherwise appear when you have to train computational neural nets. Okay. All right. Thank you.
We'll get into this later. So
okay. Yes. Thank you.
So here's a bigger case. Here we have pictures of faces from this face data set. And now these pictures have 10,000 pixels. And here it's too big. I'm not doing it all to all. I'm connecting some pixel to some other pixels. And maybe you can tell me how I did that. But you can see that we have the same sort of result. These two gentlemen are the states that I encoded in the network. And then I chose either linear springs or nonlinear springs, and I gave an initial condition which was some sort of a noisy version of this initial of this target state. And if I used nonlinear springs, I could retrieve something that looked like these two gentlemen. And if I didn't, then it's somewhere in between, I would say.
Sorry, one more. I think there was a question from Yasha Kresh who raised their hand. Maybe go ahead.
Thanks so much. Actually, it was a follow-up to something that you're asked, and there's even more reason to ask it now. So what you call initial conditions, do you know a priori, or are you even concerned about the residual, let's say, stress, strain, topography or topology that gives a rise to it, or you just let it fly without even thinking whether there is any residual, I guess you can call it energy, that will be your initial conditions, if I make myself clear?
Yeah, we are not really concerned about that. We just start with some initial condition that will have a higher energy than one of the minima, and we let it descend toward one of the minimum that it likes by doing optimization on the physical degrees of freedom, the location of the different nodes.
So it doesn't matter if the physical system has memory to begin with at all? It's kind of agnostic to it. Is that what you're saying?
So we think that the memory is encoded in the springs that you chose. It is also important, what is the initial condition is definitely determining which of the minima that you fall into. And you have to start close enough to one of the target states in order to get a state that is reasonably associated with it. But other than that, we think of this minimization as overdone, so we don't see memory effects, we don't see momentum, at least the way that we do it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. All right, so let's summarize this part of the talk. So this is an unsupervised learning task. I didn't tell the network really what I wanted it to identify. I just localized these two states in the system and let them be energy minimum. So can we do supervised learning? A bit of the harder task, if you will. So in supervised learning, the typical way that we think about it is, for example, distinguishing pictures of cats and dogs. In this case, we show the input is a literal picture, and the output is going to be a label, which we want the network to supply when it sees that input. So here's an example of a biological case for supervised learning task. So here we have a protein, and the proteins in nature evolve to have some desirable mechanical function. And the function might look like this. We might give it some ligand that connects here in the input side, and then this entire protein buckles and moves in a very interesting way that you have an output node somewhere far away that has a large motion. And the way that learning works in this system, it's actually evolution, is that evolution changes the interactions, the local elastic interactions between the residues, such that after this long evolutionary time, you have this functional motion that we saw here. So again, I'd like to think about it in a much more abstract sense, a network of balls and springs, again, with physical and learning degrees of freedom as before. In this case, we have some input displacement at the input sides and an output displacement at the output side. So let's try to train it as if we were training a machine learning algorithm. And the typical way that this works is called gradient descent. And the way to think about it is that we first define a cost function, which is the difference between the motion that you actually wanted and the one that you got. And we square it such that this function is non-negative. And we know that when this function is 0, we get exactly the desired behavior. The next thing that we do is that we take the gradient of this function, of this cost function, with respect to the learning degrees of freedom W, and we change these learning degrees of freedom anti-parallel to this gradient. And so we know that the cost function is going to decrease by doing that. We do it again and again, and eventually we reduce the cost function to a minimum. And we can do this. So we can do gradient descent on a physical system on the computer. And once we have a solution we are happy with that embodies the task that we want to train, we can build it. And you can actually do this in the lab. This is an experiment that was done in Sid Nagel's lab in Chicago in 2017. In collaboration with Jason Rocks from Penn. And here he trained this network on a computer. This is a network of springs, if you will, and there's some source here that you can press and some desired target response up here. And if you're very careful about it, you can actually manufacture it and get the same response in the lab. So that's cool. But I think the main point that I want to get across these days is that this gradient descent is not what I usually consider to be physical local learning. And there are several reasons why that is. So here's again the gradient descent algorithm, the 2 steps. And here are some issues with it. If you think about it from the point of view of one particular spring, one particular edge in this network, then computing this cost function does not make much sense because it explicitly contains this desired information, which means that if the spring knows how to compute this, it knows what the desired behavior is. So that's already a philosophical issue. But also, if you look at this gradient itself, it turns out to be a non-local operation. If you want to change a particular spring, a particular W parameter, then you have to know what all of the other parameters, all of the other W's in the network are doing at that time. And my supervisor at Penn, Andrea Liu, has a name for this kind of machines that can do that. She calls them edge demons in homage to the Maxwell demon. And it's And it's a contraption that sits on every one of those edges and can compute the gradient of cost function and change this edge in accordingly. But you see that is really hard to do. So if you want a scalable physical learning, then we need local learning rules that are physical processes that modify W with only local information. I would say that the majority of my work as a postdoc was about banishing these edge demons. Let's see how we can do that. This is one way to do supervised learning in physical networks that we like. We call it coupled learning, and it's inspired by many similar kinds of frameworks in abstract learning theory and in computer science. And it works like this. So first we start with what we call a free state, where we take the network and we only apply the inputs, and we read out the output at the output side. You can look at all of these edges, all of these springs, if you will, and each of them contains a local element, a local elastic energy associated with that spring alone in that free state. Next, we define a clamped state, which is very similar. We still apply the same inputs as the input node, but now we also apply a very small nudge on the output side in the right direction. So you can imagine that you're the supervisor. You know what the output node is supposed to be doing. The system doesn't, but you do. So you can push it a little bit in the right direction, only this output node. Once you do that, you apply an additional source on the system. So all of the local elastic energies on every one of those springs will change due to this extra force. And it turns out that you can compare these two states locally, side by side. And this gives rise to a learning algorithm, the difference between the free energy and the clamped energy with a local derivative at every side. So I talked about this maybe in the context of a spring network, but it turns out to be a general theory for any physical symmetric Hamiltonian network. It's guaranteed to be local in the learning degrees of freedom. But the most important thing is that it tends to minimize the cost function it actually wants to minimize. So it does supervised learning. Let me spend maybe a minute to try to give you some intuition why this local learning rule works. So here's an energy landscape, which might be high dimensional, but I just took a slice of it. And the x-axis is the physical state. So when we apply the input, the system is going to find a minimum, which we call the free state. It's going to be the minimum of the energy function. But this is not what we wanted the system to do. We want it to go here. So this is the desired state, but it's uphill, so it doesn't go there. So what we can do is to apply clamping. We apply forces on the system and we change the energy landscape such that it is minimized here in the desired state. Next, we apply this local learning rule, and you can see that it is composed of two parts. It's composed of a positive part at the free state and the negative part at the clamped state. And if you try to think about what these two parts are doing, then the positive part would tend to increase the energy of the free state, while the negative part will tend to decrease the energy of the clamped state. And once we do that, we get a new energy function in the next cycle. Here are the old free state and the clamped state. And here's the new free state, the new minimum of the energy function. And you can see that it is closer to where we wanted it to be. So we got a little bit closer to the desired solution. And if we do this again and again and iterate, eventually we will get as close as possible to the desired state. Okay, so that is the theory, that is the intuition, but can we make it work? So to show this, I'm now going to resistor networks, which are very similar to the spring networks that we talked about. It requires some translation. So now the physical degrees of freedom are going to be voltages at the nodes of the network. And the learning degrees of freedom instead of stiffnesses are going to be resistance values, the resistors here. So, and this is network does not really have an energy function, but it has a force balance given by Kirchhoff's laws. There's a current balance on every node. And this implies that the system minimizes the total power dissipation. So we can use that to define a local learning rule. So let's try to train it to do something. Here is a big network that I have on my computer, and it has around 500 nodes. What I want it to do is the following. I'm going to apply some voltages here in the yellow nodes, and I want particular voltages to be spit out on the orange nodes. This is the supervised learning task that I have in mind. I can apply the local learning rule again and again. And you see that the network changed quite a bit. Some of the edges completely disappeared. Some of them changed their resistance. But we can check whether the system now does what I wanted it to do by computing the error or the cost function during training. And what I find generally is that the error goes down, in this case by many, many orders of magnitude. Eventually, the error is zero, meaning that the output is exactly what I wanted it to be. And we can also train it, like we did before, but here in a supervised mode. So in this case, what I showed the network is some representation of the images of zeros. And what I trained it to do as a result is to light up this orange node right here and turn off this node right here, which is barely visible. But if you give it a picture of a 1, then the opposite happens. And this node is going to light up with a lot of voltage, and the other node is going to be, where is it? Somewhere here. It's going to be very silent. So this is the network's way of telling me they showed it either a picture of a 0 or a 1. Cool. But now you should all complain to me because I made a great deal talking about physical learning, but this is a simulation. So I showed you that I can make a silly machine learning algorithm. But the nice thing about this is that this is physically realizable. The learning rules are local, and you can build this kind of machine. And we actually have. Yes.
Can you comment on the use of a disordered arrangement versus starting with a grid?
Yes. So usually we do disorder. Okay. So the first remark I want to give is that the geometry topology of the network matters, but we don't really know how to a very good extent. What we usually do is that we start from a disordered grid or a disordered network. We have a lot of them lying around because of jump packings that we used to work on, that we still work on in Andre's lab. They tend to do better. They tend to do better than lattices in terms of they train faster, they get lower error usually. One way is that these are more disordered, so even if all of the resistances are the same, there are different ways for the current to flow from side to side. We imagine that this network has more capacity in some sense, but I don't know how to argue about this in a very systematic way. And this is definitely something that we want to look at in the future. How does the structure of the network change the learning process? But so far, all I can say is that disordered networks seem to be good for the task that we try to train them for. But the point is, this is a physical learning algorithm. You can build it. So this is the first machine that we built at Penn by Sam Dillevu, who is a postdoc with Doug Durian. And he built this machine. This is the first version of a self-learning resistor network. It's very small. There are only 16 edges here, 16 learning elements. But you can ask the question, so how can we actually build it? Because I talked about having free and clumped states, which are different boundary conditions, and we cannot really have them at the same time. So we can either have memory elements on each resistor, but that is cumbersome. So what we ended up doing instead is to duplicate the system. There's a free network and a clamped network that sits right on top of it. Each of them is seeing the respective boundary condition, either the free or the clamped state. And then twin edges in these networks can locally compare their voltage drops or their local power dissipation. And that resistor pair can decide accordingly whether they want to increase or decrease the resistance. This is how the local learning rule works in this system. And this is what an edge, a resistor pair looks like in the first version. I cannot really remark too much about that, but this is a breadboard. You can tell this much. But the nice thing is that this is an experiment. You can build it and you can train it. So in this case, we trained it on a real data set. This is the iris machine learning data set. There are different classes, 3 different classes of iris flowers. These are not photos, by the way. These are lengths and widths of part of the flower. But a machine learning algorithm is supposed to be trained to recognize and categorize these data points according to the type of iris they belong to. And the machine that we built is able to do this with a success rate of 97%, which is about what you would expect from a linear algorithm, from a linear machine learning algorithm. That makes sense because our system is also linear. So, okay, so this is very much like a computer, but there are ways in which this machine that we built is really not like a computer. One of them has to do with robustness. So in this experiment, Sam, the experimentalist, trained the system to do a particular task. So you can look at the error as a function of time, and it goes to a low number. But then he physically cuts one of the edges out. So he damages the system, and then the error shoots up because the solution that the network learned is no longer valid. But it doesn't matter because all of the network, all of the elements are the same. They can learn a new solution, and the error goes back to a small number. And you can do this again and again. In this case, he destroyed about a third of the system, and the system could still recover and learn new solutions to the problem. So this is really not like a computer, because you can imagine that if you damage the part of the CPU, you won't get this response. The computer will just stop working. All right, so let's see where I'm.
How do you input data of dimensionality so much higher than the number of degrees of freedom?
Okay, that's a good question. In this case, the number of data points is actually only 4, because we are talking about lengths and widths of part of the flower. The data set.
Oh, it's not an image, right? Sorry. Thanks.
So there are 4 inputs and 3 outputs here, which pretty much almost saturates us completely because we have 9 nodes. But we have just enough to do this task. But thank you. That's a good, very good question. And seeing that I don't really have much more time. Okay, I do want to say this. We have a new version of this machine, which is made with transistors rather than linear resistors. So this is now a non-linear system. It can solve non-linear tasks. In principle, it's much more scalable and fast. And we are in the process of building it on a chip. So we expect to have a much better system available for us pretty soon. But already this system, which has about 30 edges, is already faster than our best simulation of it. So that's pretty cool.
And can you maybe also comment a bit about energy consumption?
Yes.
Because you're doubling the number of degrees of freedom, and that's the price you're paying for not keeping track of non-local, for not having a non-local learning rule. But maybe can you, along with scalability, can you with time, can you also maybe say a little bit about power?
Yes, that's a really great question. So one of the reasons why people are thinking about these systems these days has to do with neuromorphic computing, realizing machine learning algorithms in hardware. And the reason they want to do that is because it is expected that they are going to be way, way, way more power efficient than standard computers. And the reason why that is that standard computers work with the von Neumann bottleneck. They have to slosh information from storage, from memory, and from the CPU again and again all the time. And it turns out that this dominates the energy expenditure of these machines. And in this case that we have here, in these local learning machines, the memory is really stored, is co-located with the computation. There's no sloshing around of this information. In this sense, it's much like it works a lot like the brain, where the memory is encoded in the synaptic strength itself, and this is expected to save a lot of energy. So it's a really great question. And the point I want to make about this machine, which I remind you is on breadboards and is really not very optimized to be energy efficient. If you compare this per edge, per one parameter, to the most energy efficient machine learning hardware that exists these days, we are at about a factor 3 or 4 from it. And we have no business being there. So as we scale up, as we make these systems better, and as we actually try to optimize their energy expenditure, we should do much better than standard computers in this system. And thank you so much for that question. So I think I have a few more minutes. Am I right? All right. So maybe I'll skip this part really. But what I want to say here is that we can take some inspiration from the brain. The brain is, it works very well compared to a computer. For example, it is competitive with silicon in speeds sometimes, even though it has no business being that, seeing that it is very slow on the neuron scale. But we can trace some of it to the ability of the learning to be very, very similar in time scale to the actual physical time scale of the brain. So you can think about information propagation time scales in the brain, and the learning time scales, they tend to be similar. Or learning might be a bit slower than the physics. And we can do something like this in our machines too. This is again the first version. And let me just jump forward. And what we show is that we can increase the learning rate up to the physical scale, up to the physical time scale. And we basically see the same training, the same learning dynamics. It just becomes faster, but the error is the same. So we can save a lot of time by just increasing the learning rate as long as we don't overdo it. There are some very interesting things that go on when learning becomes faster than physics, but looking at the time, I will not talk about that. What I do want to mention, maybe, is that the kind of learning rules that we thought about are not only useful for electric systems. We can also think about them in the context of mechanics. This is kind of a general framework for physical learning. And in this case, we have a self-folding sheet that can fold into different ways according to the forces that you give it. And here I'm imagining the forces as different pictures of cats and dogs, where you can imagine each picture as forcing different parts of the sheet with different force magnitudes. And in this case, you might want to train the sheet such that all the forces that we name cats fold into one sort of shape, and all of the other forces that we call dogs fold into this sort of shape. And it also generalizes. So if we show it other forces that are cats or dogs but not belonging to the training set, then it will also fold into the right desired shape. And in this case, the learning degrees of freedom, or the physical degrees of freedom, are going to be the folding angles of different creases, and the learning degrees of freedom, or useful learning degrees of freedom that we found out before, has to do with the stiffnesses of different creases. So you can imagine that the stiffer a crease is, the less it would like to fall when we force it. And we can use different stiffnesses on different creases to encourage the origami pattern to fall into certain shapes and not others. So we were able to do it on a computer. We could train it to do some subset of the Irish data set, but that is again a simulation. So let me show you a recent experiment that was done in Sid Nagel's lab in Chicago again. And we have this sheet now, this self-folding sheet, which can fold into these 4 different shapes, depending on the forces that you apply to it. And the local learning rule is going to be very cool, very low-tech. The experimentalists are pouring liquid epoxy glue into the creases, and then they fold the sheet. And you can imagine that when the sheet is folded, some of the liquid glue seeps out of the crease. And the more you fold it, the larger the folding angle, more of the glue is going to flow out of the crease. So that sheet is going to remember how you folded it, and you will have a stiffness pattern that is a function of how you trained it. So you can do that in experiments. And it turns out that you can train the sheets to fold in desired ways. So here is again this pattern that we have, depending on the forces that we apply to it. These are color-coded by the shapes it folds into. And after we train it, after the stiffnesses are changing, when we fold it into this shape, then you see that it only wants to fold into this shape, regardless of how we apply forces to it. So this sheet learned how to fold into this shape, regardless of how you force it. We don't really know how to do classification yet, or, well, we know what the rule is. Experimentally, it's hard to realize, but hopefully sometime in the future, we'll have classification by, a real origami model that can sit on your desk. So let me summarize here. We talked about learning machines, physical learning machines, and they figure out on their own how to gain function when they see inputs. We saw that we can train physical learning machines with supervised and unsupervised modes of learning. And we saw that they can learn and even generalize, like machine learning algorithms. But the important things that I want to emphasize is that first, these kind of physical learning machines have advantages over computational learning, computer design. We talked about some of them today. For example, the ability to learn continuously, but also to have robustness to damage. And the most important point is that these are real physical systems that you can build and put on your desk, and we have done so. So given all of this that I talked about, let me come again here and try to argue again why I think physical learning is exciting and a nice set of questions to think about. The first reason is that learning happens everywhere in systems that we care about, like computers and biological systems. And I believe that thinking about physical learning or physical learning machines can teach us about both machine learning and biology. Now, these are also practical systems. We know that learning is very useful for solving hard inverse design problems. So in this case, we can have a physical system that solves inverse design problems on its own, in situ, with no expert designer required. All you need to do is show it the examples of what you want it to do. And the third point is that learning is also, regardless of practical concerns, it's a fascinating emergent phenomenon in complex systems. And by learning about learning in physical systems, we might be able to find to see how it changes during this process and how interesting features arise in it. I'll skip this. This is some of the stuff that I want to do later, but given that I don't have the time, I'd like to advertise that I'll be starting a new independent position at Amos in the Netherlands in the coming summer. And we're going to have openings for students and postdocs. So if you are interested in the theory of these kinds of systems that I talked about, please contact me and I'll be very happy to talk about it. Of course, I also want to thank all of the wonderful collaborators that were instrumental to all of this, both at the University of Chicago and at the University of Pennsylvania. If you're interested in any of the details, the papers are here. I specifically want to point to this one, which is the recent review that we had on physical learning. This is a good introduction to the whole field. And finally, I want to thank all of you for being here and for the attention. Thank you very much.
Right, let's thank Naki for this fascinating talk. And what we can do is we have like 15 minutes usually reserved after the hour for questions without a recording. So I will go ahead and stop the recording, and please feel free to raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask Naki your questions.